microphone with overkill. So a couple of things. First of all, thank you very much for coming on this cold night. Happy holidays. I want to thank Fulbright for bringing me to Korea. My wife and I are leaving in a week's time, but we've had a terrific time for the last 10 months. And I've been based at the Seoul Institute of the Arts, which is in Ansan, which is way south of here. But that's really been a good laboratory for what I'm going to be talking about. And basically, this is how I present. I mean, I've long since sort of forgotten how to use notes, so forgive me if that's okay. So this is what I'm going to be talking about tonight. I am housed in the Department of Film and Media Arts at Temple University in Philadelphia. And many of my students are always wondering, as I bet many of you are, about life after undergraduate or graduate school. And particularly in the media arts, the performing arts, the fine arts, there's sort of a kind of a conceit that surrounds those disciplines that this is not something you should care about. That the arts are basically about having a passion, having a vocation. And that, you know, we've all seen those cliches about the starving artist and all the rest of this. So basically, what I think we've noticed is, in the kind of neoliberal world, is that you really cannot think like that anymore. And so what I'm going to be talking about is this. Now, I was struck by this image on the right-hand side. This is an ad for a human resources conference at COEX last month. And I kind of was really struck by how the image that they chose to use was somebody on a jib, somebody who's basically reading a newspaper while the set where typically you'd have somebody shooting a film. And I'm using this sort of dialectically to compare the old economy and the new economy, the idea that we're going from a world where people made a living with their hands and the sweat of their brow to a world where people are what Robert Wright calls symbolic analysts. Now that's strange to use a term like that to talk about somebody who's an artist or a filmmaker or a teacher. But basically the idea that we've got a fundamental change happening in the economy. And what I'm going to be talking about tonight is ways that you might think, if you were one of these students who was involved in this transition, about how one could equip oneself for this new world. So we have the idea of the transition from the old to the new economy. By the way, when I talk about this back in Pennsylvania, I typically show two images from Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. And Bethlehem, of course, is the original home of steel and the armaments industry in the US. But that same plant is now used as a backlot, most recently used in the Transformers films. So basically, it's sort of this interesting transition from the old economy to the new. So I've got two quotes here. And here's a quote from somebody who's sort of the kind of one of the gurus of this new world of the creative economy. This is Richard Florida. And probably that's a name familiar to many of you because he talks about the idea of the creative city, and he's become somebody who's the go-to person if you're interested in rebuilding your city around the arts. This is what he says. We're living in the eye of the storm, a period of life-altering creative destruction as a new economic order and a new way of life emerges from the old. And you hear a lot of that, the idea of creative destruction. That's almost kind of a neo-Marxist thing, isn't it? The idea that capitalism is sort of solvent, all that's solid melts into earth. And then here's another person, and it's interesting, neither of these are particularly liberal thinkers. Here we have Tyler Cowen, who's a great public intellectual and economist. And he says in the last 5 years, more has changed in the economics of culture than any comparably short period of human existence. Well, what's this got to do with Korea? This has been a wonderful place to look closely at this transition from the old economy to the new economy. I've been looking at the way in which increasingly Korea is building a economy where it's less interested in building flat screen TVs than the content that will be shown on those flat screen TVs. And that's not a new sensibility. In the mid-90s, the president of Korea learned that you had to sell over 1 million hundies overseas to make as much money as the first Jurassic Park was making. So if you think about that, that makes the idea of the creative economy quite enticing. So I'm sure you've heard this term Hallyu, the idea of the Korean wave. And my concern here has been to look at, well, how does functioning, living, working in a creative economy like Korea lead to opportunities where you can actually make a living? Now, you probably know that Korea has a very disproportionately large cultural footprint. For such a small country, it really is able to transcend the bounds of being so small. And in areas like games, music, movies to some extent, broadcast, it really is able to punch significantly above its weight. And the term that you most typically hear from Korea is that of the contents industries. This is the only country where you don't talk about content, you talk about contents. And we've got a situation where the industry is basically thriving. So what I've been looking at, what I've been talking to my students at Seoul Arts about is, to what extent does that create opportunities for young people? Now in this country, and actually Douglas was talking about this last month, you've got a country that had a very rigid control of culture up until very recently. And it's kind of interesting that all the energy that was going into censorship and cultural control seems in some ways to have found its way into encouraging culture. And so what we've got is a kind of government support for the arts and the culture industries that's the envy of many countries of comparable size. But this bullet point is the one that I'm always curious about. If you're talking about culture, if you're talking about the creative economy, is it primarily something that's trickled down? Is it something that can be encouraged by the government? Or is it something that is from the bottom up? For example, I don't know how many of you have been to the industrial area of Malai, if that's how you pronounce it. But it's interesting to see an area of Seoul that's crowded with little workshops that are interspersed with artist studios. And that what they've figured out is a way of creating a community of artists that has managed to kind of insinuate its way into the local economy, completely without government support. So I'm always struck by the balance between trickle-down, central control, and what happens at the grassroots level. And then the bottom of this slide that I keep going back to as well, to what extent does this create work? And the point that I make when I talk about precarity is that the whole nature of work, the whole idea of labor is in flux right now. Whether you're an Uber driver or an adjunct instructor, whether you're working on a 0 hours contract in a fast food place, whether you're a filmmaker who is working from project to project, paycheck to paycheck, you're basically working in an economy where things are very uncertain. Now again, the degree to which the Korean government supports the arts and culture industries is the envy of many places. I don't know if you know, for example, the extent to which the government of Seoul, the city, is very supportive of things like the film industry. Most of the examples that I use are actually drawn from film and television, my own background, but they could be talking about many other things, dance, for example. But basically, you have the instance of the Seoul Film Commission, which has gone to great pains to attract filmmakers to come and work here. So if you've seen films like the Avengers films, they almost randomly end up shooting scenes in the streets of Seoul, for example. Okay. Now, if you go to film school, whether you're in Korea, European country, or the US, Are you learning a profession? Is it a professional school? What does it mean to be a professional? What does it mean to be an expert? What does it mean to be an amateur? And that whole tension between being an amateur and a professional is something that's increasingly prone to be discussed in lots and lots of areas. So for example, if you talk about being a professional, are you describing somebody who's got a skill or expertise? If you go to the dentist, you want a professional dentist. You don't want an amateur dentist, for example. Is it a question of having a credential? Up until very recently, if you wanted to be an author, creative writer, you would go and live in New York and struggle. Now you go to the University of Iowa and get an MFA, right? But basically, credentials have kind of overtaken the marketplace for so many different cultural areas. Are there barriers to entry? Do you need a union card? Do you have to join a guild? And do you have to earn the right to belong to one of those guilds? In many countries, what you find is that the guilds are kind of trying to police the borders of, say, the film industry, of television, but you typically find that there's a dichotomy between the younger people and the older people. Are there common standards? Are there criteria that you accept about behaving professionally? And then is there a professional association? Lawyers have a bar that they have to pass. Is there anything like that if you're a filmmaker or a dancer or an actor? There's an equity card. Right? There's all kinds of ways in which culture workers have to adhere to some of the same standards as other kinds of professionals. But this is where I've been spending a lot of my time for the last several years, looking at the relationship between these two terms, precariety and creativity. Now, I don't know if you recognize the character on the left. You can probably see that he's wearing, I don't know if he works in a convenience store or a fast food chain or what have you, but that's Saint Precario, who is the patron saint of precarious workers in Italy. He's been around for about a decade, and he regularly crops up on May Day and so forth. And basically, he's become the kind of spokesperson or the symbol for the casualization of work. The idea that more and more economies are based on casual, freelance, project-based work. As I said, probably most people in this room have had some experience of working in a freelance economy. But here's the thing that's interesting. Increasingly, what we're finding is that higher and higher status work is also becoming precarious. It's kind of interesting. If you look at the tech industry, it's incredibly precarious. If you look at education, it's incredibly precarious. So basically, this idea that everything has become contingent has found its way into every part of the workforce. Well, it's kind of interesting that the fine and performing arts have always been precarious. Actors and artists have always lived from paycheck to paycheck or painting sale to painting sale. And media production is, my field is becoming increasingly precarious also. The idea that you, these days, can hire contingent workers to shoot a television series or a film and then reassemble a team for the next project. The culture industries, what Angela McRobbie calls the glamour industries, like fashion, all of these are becoming basically very precarious. Now, what can you do about that? In Korea, my understanding is that there are some opportunities for support for the artists who are having a hard time making ends meet. But there's nothing akin, for example, to a system they have in France, where workers who work in music, who work in film, actually get a subsidy from the government. They're able to go from project to project because they have support from the government. These are some of our students at Seoul Arts. And what I've been curious about is what are the things that somebody who aspires to work in the culture industry as a filmmaker, a game designer, a digital artist, what are the things that they think will equip them for life after graduation? And I think there's some interesting distinctions here. Are we teaching people simple skills? Is this something that you can regard as sort of an investment, as something that is part of the store of human capital, to quote Gary Becker? Or is this somebody for whom this is their passion, this is their vocation? They have no alternative vision. This is what they have to do to be a whole person. Is there this idea that you are going to be involved in arts for art's sake? Or is there a possibility of making a living? And so that tension is the one that I think we have to have people who are in the culture industries figure out. What about the idea of the arts versus the creative economy? It's kind of interesting. If you take a degree in arts management, it's overwhelmingly working in nonprofits. It's overwhelmingly thinking about going to the public purse to make ends meet. Very rarely is there a sense that what you're going to do is figure out how to actually sell your skills. And even that idea of selling your skills, are you selling out? The idea that to be an artist in some ways is not to be tainted by commerce. It's something that you hear again and again. Now in this country, what we've got, as I said, is this idea of contents. And we have organizations like the Korea Creative Contents Association. That you've got organizations like this that are going to great pains to support creativity which isn't housed in traditional platforms. But what kind of term can we use? And all these terms are incredibly slippery. Do we talk about the creative, the culture, or the content industries? Those terms each mean something a little bit different. And then kind of complicating that even more is the idea that you have this very critical sense, going back to the 1930s and 40s in the Frankfurt School, that the culture industries are evil. If you talk about the culture industry and you belong to the Frankfurt School tradition, you're basically thinking about an industry that's in the business of manipulation, that's in the business of turning you into some kind of pseudo-individual. So basically what I'm looking at is the idea of redefining creativity and content. Now when I show this image, my students always kind of get a rise out of this. The idea of, well, what's life going to be like when I leave this place? And I think nowhere is this more true than if you're graduating with a degree in the fine arts, the performing arts, the media arts. So if you're in a creative writing program, nobody spends much time talking about the actual mechanical tools. There's no course on how to use a particular kind of word processing program to become a creative writer. You take that as given. The tool is not that important. But when you're in a media program or a performing arts program, often the tools become disproportionately important. You spend so much time talking about craft skills that you lose sight that perhaps what you're really interested in is creating a vision or creativity as opposed to craft skills. Now, one of the things that I think is interesting is the idea of the artist is sort of historically new in some ways. Shakespeare didn't think of himself as an artist. He thought of himself as an artisan. Think about that word playwright, right? It's like shipwright, right? Somebody who makes something. And so that distinction between artist and artisan is speaking to that distinction between being creative and somebody who's applying craft skills. So we've got this sort of evolution right now in this sort of definition of what we think the artist is. Are they the hard-working artisan toiling away, whether they're writing a play or designing a new video game? Or are they perhaps, and I think this is more traditionally what we think the artist is, the solitary genius toiling away, making something late into the night? Or, and this is the other distinction we just talked about, the idea of the credentialed professional, the person with the MFA. It's interesting, the New York Times recently had an article called, "Is the MFA the new MBA?" The idea that your ability to be free-thinking and innovative perhaps trumped having the kind of, that's an unfortunate word, isn't it, Trump? But basically the idea of somebody who is able to apply ideas in a free-form way probably wouldn't if he had a more rigid form of education. So this is the dichotomy that I've been talking about for the last 20 minutes. It's sort of interesting, that word or that term, gig economy, 3 years ago, that word was, or term was basically unheard of. Now it's become, I'm surprised it's not the word of 217, to be honest with you. But it's kind of interesting that gig is a term taken from music. The idea that the musician would go from gig to gig, job to job. And the idea now that the gig, in some ways, has become the norm. The gig has, in some ways, displaced the idea of salaried work. Now, this is equally true here. When I've been talking to my students at Seoul Arts, I've been really struck by how all of them are thinking about going from gig to gig. All of them think in terms of networking, where you go from project to project. None of them think, well, I'm going to have a lifetime job with Samsung or KBS. That doesn't seem even an option in some ways. Now, the arts have always been gig-based. But what's kind of interesting is that artists, media professionals, in some ways, they've become kind of like the new model citizens for this economy. What the powers that be expect is for everybody to behave like artists, to feel comfortable with the idea of being not rooted in a particular position. So this is basically, I think, if you're in a creative fine arts program or a media program, this is basically what we're talking about. I think this notion of the entrepreneurial self, in some ways, I keep using the word trumps the idea of teaching craft skills. But I think it comes at a cost. To what extent is this a teachable moment? The idea of equipping somebody to think about how to become entrepreneurial. And I think that's an interesting transition, a change in language, going from the idea of the professional to the entrepreneur. Now, to what extent is this teachable? I'm kind of struck by this play on words, agency. A lot of people talk about the idea of the free agent these days. Baseball has had agency for a long time, the idea of being a free agent. What if we all become free agents in everything that we do? In academia, we've got a lot of free agents these days. We call them adjuncts or contract work. But basically, if you are teaching somebody to be entrepreneurial, you're basically asking them to think about a particular set of skills. You're asking them to know about marketing and small business management and how to file your taxes. And I think a lot of people think, well, that's not why I went to art school. That's not what I was interested in doing. And yet that's basically responsibly what you have to do. But here's the other thing, and I'm not sure how this quite relates to the Korean context. Increasingly, if you're in the business of promoting yourself, of, I hate this phrase, being your own brand. If you're doing that, every opportunity, every exchange, every conversation becomes a chance for you to promote yourself. Self-promotion becomes the way in which you relate to other people. So how can you do that and remain authentic? How can you do that and remain true to yourself? Now again, I'm very aware that how people relate to other people in different countries varies enormously, and I've still not figured out how this works in the Korean context. Now this is a very famous article. This is the last quote that I'll give you tonight. This was William Deresiewicz 2 years ago really set the world on fire with a cover story in Atlantic Monthly with an article called The Death of the Artist and the Birth of the Creative Entrepreneur. And this article was being passed around art schools and music departments and film schools everywhere because he was basically blowing the lid off everything I've been talking about this evening. Here's what he says. You're supposed to build your brand, your network, your social media presence. Creative entrepreneurship is spawning its own institutional structure. Online marketplaces, self-publishing platforms, non-profit incubators, collaborative spaces. But the fundamental relationship remains creator to customer, with creators handling or superintending every aspect of the transaction. So he's basically challenging everything that we've been describing as the entrepreneurial self. But how much of this is teachable? One of the things that I've been doing as part of my research in Korea is looking at the different university career centers. And it's interesting looking at how many places really have not invested in this at all, whereas other schools, and I'm not mentioning any names, have really put a lot of resources into career services and placement services. The government, and we've got this organization called the Career Research Institute for Vocational and Education and Training, is very interested in creating incubators, exactly the kind of thing that Deresiewicz was talking about. And what we find is that these organizations are actually having a very hard time transitioning away from a focus on salaried work to the kind of part-time free agency that I've been talking about. It's also much more helpful if you're interested in STEM or business-based careers, that they've really not figured out yet what you can do for professional development in the arts. And then the other thing is, well, what about the long term? What about working with alumni? What about working with people in the community? Again, at Seoul Arts, I've been really struck by how there's sort of a reluctance to have any kind of dealings with people other than the students who are actually enrolled in the institute at this time. And then the other thing that's sort of really important, and this is something that I think needs to be looked at much more closely in Korea, is actually gathering data about freelance work. What you find is that the government does a great job of tracking full-time employment, but project-based contingent freelance work almost completely kind of is under the radar. That's kind of interesting. Exactly the same thing is true in the United States, that the Bureau of Labor Statistics there is absolutely terrible at tracking freelance employment. So what actually constitutes work? How can you track somebody who probably doesn't file taxes on a regular basis? How can you follow somebody whose earnings are sporadic? It's very hard to do, and yet it's really vital. If you try and figure out outcomes, and the outcomes have a lot to do with free agency, how can you figure out what to do to see what you can do as a scholar, as an academic, to improve their outcomes? So this is from the Krivet's research findings now, and this purports to give you the number of people working in all the different aspects of the contents workforce in Korea. And if you look at this, you'll see, for example, there are, what, 198,262 people working in publishing, 4,503 people working in animation. I think numbers like this are pretty meaningless. They're helpful because you need to know as a baseline who's involved, but I think that they way underestimate how many people are working in particular fields. They don't get at precariety. What can you do? I'm sure you all recognize the poster there from Darren Aronowitz's Black Swan. What you may not know is that it's famous for a lawsuit brought by 2 interns who felt that they'd been marginalized, exploited, not paid for working very full-time on a film. Exactly the same thing has happened many times here in Korea. But basically, this is one of those things that you hear a great deal. You have to have an internship to make your way into the professional world, especially if it's in the glamour industries. So I talked about the idea of the cult of the internship. And there's been a lot of discussion recently. I don't know if you've seen Ross Perlin's book, Intern Nation. But Perlin and other people are talking about how it's such an uneven play or unlevel playing field in the world of internships. Is it paid or unpaid? Are you actually learning anything? Is there any possibility of a real opportunity afterwards? Now here's one thing where I've actually noticed that Korea seems to be significantly ahead of the US, and that's that there are a number of schemes, and Seoul Arts has been participating in this, where you will actually compensate, you'll financially compensate both somebody who offers an internship and who is mentoring somebody in a real way, and you will compensate the person who's pursuing the internship, who's being mentored at the same time. We have nothing like that in the United States, and I think that's a good opportunity there. The other thing that you have in Korea is a real concerted effort to nurture startup culture. And it's sort of interesting that startups in this country are very disproportionately about tech. But increasingly what you'll find is that there are people who are using the same mindset to try and have startups around the culture industries. So this is taken from the website of the Korea Contents Lab, which has this network of co-working spaces all over Korea. And they're basically using the business school model to see how you can nurture the arts as part of the creative economy. So I don't know if you've been to any of these co-working spaces, and there's lots of co-working spaces for the arts in Seoul and other cities in Korea. But basically, this is sort of one of the ways in which, in this country, I think this is a real opportunity to grow. And that's the website for Kopia. And that's me. I kind of ended abruptly there. All right. Well, you can see I'm kind of agonizing and thinking through a lot of this. So let me ask you, what would you like to discuss? What would you like to talk about further on the basis of a very kind of free-form presentation? Yes?
This is just a very quick question. Something that you mentioned towards the beginning is that Korea is one of the few contexts where you speak of contents in the plural as opposed to the singular. I was wondering if you could just expand upon that.
Well, I actually don't know why that is, to be honest with you, why it does have a plural. In Europe and in North America, it's sort of interesting that the culture industries evolved into the creative economy and the creative industries. And the idea behind that was, well, if we do that, we move away from culture, we can also talk about things like biotech. We can also talk about kind of, and then you hear the word innovation creep into that. You can be creative in all kinds of ways that don't have to be restricted to culture. And I do think that this is the only country that really has this sort of generic term content, right? And then suddenly it becomes plural because content is webtoons, it's movies, it's television, it's K-pop, it's K-drama. It becomes all these other things. But I think that would actually be an interesting area to look at. Why do this idea of a plural content? I'm not sure. Okay. Other thoughts? Yes.
Just curiosity, I'm guessing you've been here about a year?
Yeah.
Right? So then you've been here during the time of shift from the Park Geun-hye government to the current one. Now, Park Geun-hye government was associated with the creative economy as one of the signature policies, right? Have you noticed a change after Park Geun-hye government went down and the Moon Jae-in government came in terms of how people are interacting with this idea of the creative economy?
You know what, I've not seen any changes yet, and I do think there's this idea of paying lip service to the idea of the creative economy. You're right, we've been here long enough to see that change, but I've not seen anything practical. But have you?
You know, I've had my head down and been just working, so I really have no idea. I don't think I've been hearing creative economy as much since the end of Park Geun-hye government. And even talking with people who were associated with, say, Korean government officials, for example, a lot of them actually, even on Park Geun-hye, were saying, I don't know what this is. I don't know what am I supposed to be telling my foreign counterparts? We have this creative economy policy, but I don't think anybody knows what it is. If you go to the Korean government websites, there's supposed to be some definition of creative economy, but
no,
it doesn't make sense.
No,
and,
no.
You know,
even in the U.S., the idea of creative economy is very loose. So at our university, for example, we regularly get a message from central administration that will say, well, how many people are you putting into the creative economy? And we'll get back to them, well, what do you define as the creative economy? So yeah, it's become this sort of catch-all term that maybe isn't that useful in some ways. Yeah. On the other hand, I think precariety has become very useful, and it's kind of interesting, creativity, and there's all kinds of new books now with the words precarious and creativity in the titles, right? Lots of them. Other thoughts?
I'm really curious to know why you started researching this topic, how long you've been interested in, like, specifically like the entrepreneurship part of this.
Sure.
Just as like a millennial, I guess, who watches YouTube and
Sure.
all, like, that's immediately what I thought of when you brought that up. And everyone's trying to do it, and like my buddy just moved to LA. Like, someone will ask, like, do you have a YouTube channel? How many followers do you have? Like, that's a very common question there. So I don't know, why did you choose?
As an old person, why did I do this?
Well,
Okay.
I'm just curious. Like,
Well, I have one suggestion for you. Have you seen a Frontline documentary called Generation Like?
no.
It's really an excellent documentary.
Okay.
You can actually get it on YouTube. But there's a cultural thinker called Doug Rushkoff, who's a really great person. And every couple of years, he puts out a new documentary about the culture industries. And Generation Like is 2014, and he's basically interested in the economy of likes. And there's this moment in this documentary where he asks a group of young people that are a little bit younger than you, but they're all sat around basically spending time choosing what's going to be the image for their website. And they start talking about, well, what do you feel about this idea of maybe you're selling out? And none of them actually knows what that term means.
What? Wait, what do you mean?
You know,
They don't know what it means.
Right, that basically they think it has to do with building your own brand. It doesn't have anything to do with the idea of inauthenticity.
Well, it's interesting you talked about entrepreneurship. It would be good to sell out, like, in a way, right? To, like, this connotation that's attached to selling out, does it not change if your purpose is to establish this brand, right?
So
If everything you're trying to do is to support the creation of this established brand, then your intention should always be to sell out to a certain extent.
Well, that's the way that they turn it around,
yeah,
right?
Switching, like, that's a good thing.
Well, they think it is, but again, you asked about why I'm interested in this. For my generation, the connotations are very, very different. Yeah, it's almost the opposite. How did I get interested in this? I was the chair of our department for like 7 or 8 years. And I would regularly have conversations with parents who would say, how is my son or daughter going to make a living? And so this became very pressing for me. And then the very first image that I started with of the kind of the steelworks and the person on the crane with the that could be Philadelphia. Philadelphia has really reinvented itself around the heritage industries, culture industries, the arts, co-working spaces, and it's really interesting. Spaces that used to be factories have become artist studios. Spaces that used to be, kind of storehouses, and now, kind of indie hall places.
That's like a worldwide phenomenon.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. It is. And so that's why I became interested in this. And to be honest with you, why I became interested in this is, what can I do to make sure that my students are the most competitive at doing this? How can I bottle this stuff and make my students drink it, become the Kool-Aid? Yeah, exactly. So when I came here, I was very interested in being at a school where students, it's a very, very competitive school to get into. But as far as I can tell, there's not much that's done to do any of this stuff. And again, I'm not maligning a school that's been very, very nice to me. But when I've been asking things like, well, what do your students do next? Well, there are many people who are like idols who went to Seoul Arts. And there's many people who, if you look in television or who's advertising the new tonic or what have you, they're a Seoul Arts grad. But that's like, I don't know, a couple of %. What about everybody else? And I think a lot of art schools don't know. A lot of performing arts places don't know what happens to most of the grads. And frankly, I think you have to in some ways. So you're right, the idea of being a millennial is a lot to do with the idea of fending for yourself. You have no choice in some ways. And that's even more true here than it is in the US in some ways, right? I mean, youth unemployment in certain categories is much more pressing here than it is back in the United States. Other thoughts? Yeah.
Well, I had the opportunity to be discussing with you and Douglas before the presentation, and just with the whole net neutrality being a topic in the United States, I don't know if that's been reverberated down over here to Korea, if that's something that's kind of just a trickle notion by other organizations that monitor web use, but like you can expand it to content. So what would the future be for?
That's an interesting. You mean, what would the future be if we don't have net neutrality? I mean, in a lot of ways, it's really the Wild West here in terms of digital culture. And what you talked about different people having their own channels. All my students at Seoul Arts have a channel. They're all producing content. Everybody is producing content with this cornucopia of stories and images in some ways. And so, is there going to be a big shakeout? Of course there is. How many people can monetize this? I think a very small number of people are going to be able to do that. But I don't want to be kind of, bleak or nihilistic about any of this, but I'm being realistic in some ways. But I do think in Korea there's going to be this massive triage in some ways. And when you have, K-pop groups performing at the American Music Awards, you're really talking about a little country that's figured out for the time being how to really kind of circulate its culture way above its own national boundaries. And I think you can find lots and lots of people feeling they have to globalize. Lots of people. Yep.
And they've been trying to do that for decades. Yeah.
So one question I know comes up a lot in studio arts in particular is the question of how one makes, say, a CV or a resume for the era of precarious labor. So obviously the standard categories usually still apply, like education and internships, etc. But then all these other things like one's online presence and one night shows at apartment galleries, and all these things that play into these kind of networks that we've been talking about. I was wondering if you've seen or how that's kind of how that plays out for your students that you've been working with. Like how do they present themselves on paper?
Well, that's kind of, a lot of them are not on paper at all. And I work with a lot of people who are media professionals, and CVs have basically become irrelevant. Most CVs that people submit are read by computers anyway, looking for keywords. They're not something that people peer over. But your first point is very well taken, which is how can I kind of actually get credit for the idea that I had a one-night show? I mean, the same thing is happening in academia when people now are self-publishing, as opposed to peer review, open access. All of these things are basically, kind of, it's hard to know how legitimate and valid they are. And so the idea of how one presents oneself, as far as I can tell, it's sort of ironic that just as digital culture has become so important, face-to-face contact and kind of what we call the reputational economy has become so important these days. The idea of having people who can trust you, who can rely on you, that's become so important, much more than paper, I think. Yeah?
How have you engaged with the art scene here in Korea?
Primarily, again, I live way away. I've been looking at the arts on campus, and it's been really interesting seeing how incredibly professional, whether we're talking about musical or dance or theatrical performances, and so everybody is basically thinking about being professional before they graduate. I mean, I compared the performances that I've seen in Korea with the student performances I see at my own school in Philadelphia, and they really are kind of at a different level in some ways, which is interesting. And the other thing that I've done is be very curious about this process that I described of building areas around cultural production, seeing how maybe a neighborhood reinvents itself. I'm very curious, being kind of like an urban ethnographer in some ways, seeing how you reinvent a place around the culture industries.
Well, I guess I'm interested in how, so you talked a little bit about how credentialing is working, and how, like, you mentioned validation and how you have these instances on your CV, right? So is this valid enough to be represented? Like,
Right.
How well accepted was this? How well received was this? Is it enough to then give it the stamp of validation to say that this is something worthy of speaking on when I'm going to sell myself or to brand myself? So how has that worked within these spaces that you're moving through? Or like, how do your students, how are they getting this validation or this new type of credential that you're talking about?
Right.
If you're doing so much self-promotion, then where is that outward, I guess, like that validation coming from, and like how does that work within these circles, I guess?
Well, I do think it's a lot to do with internships. I think it's a lot to do with alumni networks.
Yeah.
I think it's a lot to do with bringing people back onto campus. And all of this sounds really rote in some ways, but I think that's the only way that you can do that, is to figure out some ways in which the professional world and the academic world can become intertwined. But I do think that there's been this massive inflation of the number of people who actually have college degrees now. I don't know if anybody saw in today's Huffington Post, but there's this very depressing story about millennials talking about how jobs that used to have a high school diploma to get, these days you need a college diploma. You probably know more people go to college here than anywhere else, so that devaluation of your credential is happening here with a vengeance in lots of ways. So you have to go outside of that.
Yeah.
One of the things that we're doing at Temple is actually having electronic portfolios. How can I show what I can do? By showing literally, this is the body of work that I can do. And so in my field, in film, things like the demo reel, things like the audition, things like the pitch. These are all things that are rarely taught explicitly, but they become really part of this presentation of self stuff. But as I said, you have to figure out how to do all of this whilst remaining authentic, remaining true to yourself. Yeah.
I just, you mentioned earlier about how your students, their level of production is on a different level from your students in Temple, the students that you have here. And like, I'm really into comparative education as a teacher who like is teaching in Korea from the States. And when I would say something very similar about my students here compared to my students back in the States. And I just like want to know if like Korea, did you come to Korea with the intention of comparing the Korean students with your students back home, or is that just something that happened in your...
That wasn't part of my agenda to be here.
Right.
It's just something that I became very aware of. And the school that I'm at here has about 3,000 students. The academic unit that I'm in back at Temple, Center for Cinematic and Performing Arts, has about 3,000 students. So it just sort of naturally became something to compare similar things. We're looking at opportunities for exchange between students, or ways that we could use telepresence to be teaching classes between the two. But basically, I don't want to say these students are really bad, these are good. I mean, it's not like that. There are kind of comparative cultural things that are very different.
Well, I was actually really curious so you specifically use the word different, and that's the word that I would use, because like, I think it's impressive, that's true, but I think it's because I've just never seen it work quite like this before. So in what ways would you say that your students here have been different? Like, what makes you say that the level of production is just like yeah.
Okay, so again, I'll use an example from film, if I can. In motion pictures, we made this distinction between above the line and below the line. Above the line means you have a lot of creative input, a lot of creative control. Scriptwriters, directors, cinematographer. Below the line is basically you do what you're told, right? You have crew. I notice here that the people who do crew work so well together. This almost sounds like kind of a cliche in some ways of what we think Asians are like, but they are superb at working together to light a scene or to put on a production. And I see a level of commitment and diligence that I'm not used to back in the US. So that's the big distinction that I see there, I think.
Is that because there's maybe fewer of those under the line, where they work more often with each other, or is there just that charisma that...
I think they've figured out a way to do that. It's kind of interesting that in the US, I think people are reluctant to go from above to below the line. And when I would greet the incoming class of 200 freshmen, and I'd say, who wants to be a director? Everybody puts their hand up, right? But by the fourth year, everybody's figured out, I'm going to be working for a director. I'm not going to be the director. I think here, people figure that out much sooner.
When you tell that like story, it just reminds me of like chung, the like Korean like, value of chung.
Yep.
So how much like cultural investigation, like how much did you have to learn about Korean culture, or did you already learn before you came here?
No, I am still learning, and the whole chung thing is something my wife and I kind of marvel at every day.
I see it in my schools too.
Yeah, we see that every day.
Yeah.
I think we have about 5 more minutes if there's any other questions.
I just want to tell you a story about chum. It happened this morning. We get up at 5:30 and put on an immense amount of clothes and ride our bikes to the Olympic pool to go for swimming. And when we got there, Paul's tire was flat. And we're talking at 6:30 in the morning. It's black outside. We go inside to the sports center and we ask if there's a pump anywhere, and nobody knows if there's a pump. And I see somebody that I have a relationship with, and I said, "Do you know where there's a pump?" And then I go, and so we figured we'll just have to walk the bike home. So I go into the locker room and my phone rings. Who's calling me at 6:30 in the morning? And she said she called a friend of hers who came and pumped up our bicycle. I mean, I would never do that.
But you would after living here, right?
And that translates to all of these students working together in a way that we do not know
Yeah.
how to do.
Right, that's exactly right.
Yeah.
And, you know, so that's one of, along with understroke reading, that's one of the
I guess I have a question that's interesting, kind of looking at the kind of this gig mindset, and I know working kind of as a utility in the United States, like there's very much this competitiveness, and there's just very much this notion when you kind of work under the line of this like totem pole, like you come in and you work your way as a utility up kind of like the ladder,
Right,
and who gets
right,
the good,
right.
who gets the gigs and who doesn't.
Right.
And so how does that, have you seen that play out in a different level of competitiveness? Have you seen a kind of hyper competitiveness develop between students, or is that an aspect you're looking at? If everyone has to sell themselves,
Right,
I have to sell myself better than you,
right.
essentially. So how has that come up in any way, the way you're looking at now, if everyone's having this entrepreneurial mindset, but yet we're in this kind of academic space where we're all trying to figure out how to do that, and you want to equip your, like, how has that come up, I guess?
One story, it's funny you should mention this point because just yesterday I was reading a PhD dissertation at a USC, which was an ethnography of film students.
Yeah.
And it's about hustling in film school.
Yeah.
That's sort of the roughly the title. And basically what they're looking at is exactly what you said, the kind of hyper competitiveness. I have not seen that at all. Maybe I don't speak Korean, so it'd be very hard for me to actually figure out how much that is really going on.
Yeah.
What I do see is one thing that's identical here to in the US, which seems like there's a gender disparity. The guys are always the ones who end up with the equipment.
Exactly.
And which is something that is very wrong and upsetting. But basically, I've not seen that as being significantly different here. But the hustling is very interesting. Where you're right. I want to collaborate with you.
Yeah.
But I want to be the one who gets the opportunity afterwards.
How could precarity not breed competitiveness?
Right,
And
exactly.
essentially, like if there's a limited amount of resources, then by default, I have to compete with you to a certain extent.
Exactly.
Right, to out-network myself, to be the one that gets the call back after
Exactly.
on the next job. Right?
Exactly.
So that'd be an interesting kind of thing to maybe examine, especially if you're looking at how to best equip your students. Well, okay, there's this kind of competitive mindset you have to have, but like you said, you don't want to, if you're working on a crew, like you still want to have that collaborative aspect, right? So it's this very thin line that you have to toe, that I'm working with you, but I also have to outwork you, because if I'm seen outworking you, I'll get the call back and you win.
Right. I mean, there's all kinds of levels of performance here that are really interesting. Yep.
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Cool. Right. Last point. I think. Yes, sir.
Do you think actually that perhaps, I've been reading articles about this here and there, suggesting that the arts model also might be the model for all work everywhere.
Right.
And what do you think of that? Do you think that might be true? Do you think it might actually be?
I think that's what is happening, and I don't think that's a good thing.
Yeah.
Let's put it that way. I think that's very much what's happening. The idea of us being project-based, of being having to do this, exactly what she was describing, that it's a race to the bottom in all kinds of ways.
Yeah.
Yep, and I don't think it's a good thing, but I think the arts model is really, in my abstract I talked about the idea of being the entrepreneurial self is sort of lionized, and it's exactly right. And so when the New York Times talked about the MFA being the new MBA, that's exactly what they're describing. Yeah, but I don't think that's a good thing.
Yeah, because that creates an excuse for all companies just to say, well, you guys can just be, we don't retain you, pay you salary or benefits or anything. We'll just hire from gig to gig. You just, and then nobody has any security at all.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Read today's Huffington Post,
It's
and there's a lot of this about it.
So everybody, everyone applause for Mr. Swann.
Thank you.